Hey biology students! In this lecture video, we're going to talk about viral latency. So pictured here on the screen, we see somebody who is experiencing a viral outbreak of herpes. So this person has oral herpes, which is caused by the Herpes Simplex virus. Which is a virus that also infects the genital mucosa as well as the oral mucosa. And so somebody who has outbreaks of herpes, either the oral herpes or the genital herpes, will experience frequent and chronic outbreaks throughout their life. Why is that? Why is it that it just doesn't go away as the immune system fights the virus? The reason is that some viruses, not all, but some, have a latency stage in their life cycle, in addition to the lytic stage. So in the first video, we describe the life cycle of bacteriophage. And we talk about how this virus infects bacterial cells and was used as a model organism to first describe the two different life cycles that can be observed in viruses. So we learned about the lytic pathway, pictured here. And remember, the outcome of the lytic pathway will be death of the host cell and release of many viral progeny from that infected cell. Now, when this process occurs in humans, where we have an infection caused by a virus that invades human cells, and a lytic cycle is initiated by that virus, this process occurs, and the immune system is alerted that cells are damaged by the virus and release inflammatory chemicals that initiate inflammation. And that is usually associated with symptoms of an infection, which in the case of herpes would be a very characteristic blister that occurs either in the mouth or on the genitals. And oftentimes we refer to that as an outbreak. So somebody has an outbreak of herpes, oral herpes or genital herpes, there is a visible sore on their mouth or on their genitals. So let's consider that when a lytic pathway occurs in a viral infection, this results in an outbreak. An outbreak of the virus. That means the lytic cycle is initiated, and with that comes death of host cells. It comes with release of many viral progeny to go and infect more host cells. And it comes with usually an inflammatory response from the immune system. And so in the case of herpes, so HSV, herpes simplex virus, a herpes simplex virus outbreak will result in the characteristic sores, oral sores, or genital sores. And we saw the person with the oral herpes on the front slide. So not all viruses demonstrate the second pathway, okay? So understand that that is not the case. The lysogenic pathway is not the case for all viruses. So there are only a few that do this. Okay, so some viruses have the ability to undergo a process we call latency. Now, when we looked at this in the first lecture video, we called it the lysogenic pathway of the bacteriophage. And recall what that involves. It still involves a virus infecting a host cell, but when the lysogenic pathway is initiated, that viral nucleic acid will integrate into the host DNA, and the genes of that virus are essentially in the off position, meaning that the viral proteins will not be produced in the cell during the lysogenic pathway. In addition, the virus will replicate along with the host cell. And this can go on for a certain amount of time, a sort of undetermined amount of time. And then various environmental factors will trigger that virus to essentially come out of hibernation and re-enter the lytic stage. So notice there is an arrow connecting, again, the lytic pathway and the lysogenic pathway. Now, when we talk about this in terms of human infections, rather than use the word lysogeny, we use the word latency. And once again, this is a second life cycle that not all viruses do. So there are only certain types of viruses that demonstrate a lytic and a lysogenic pathway. And Herpes simplex virus happens to be one of those types. So when someone initially becomes infected with herpes simplex virus, which is by direct contact with a sore, what happens is that the virus will initiate a lytic cycle and produce many copies of itself that then release from the host cell. But for an unknown reason, some of that viral nucleic acid will integrate into the host cell chromosome. And now this will initiate the second life cycle of herpes simplex virus, which we call latency. And we can think of latency as a dormant stage in the life cycle of this virus. In other words, when the virus is in latency, it is not infectious. The person is generally not contagious. No new virus is being shed by this individual. There's no visible display of the infection, meaning that the sores on the mouth or the genitals have gone away. And the virus stays in cells for an undetermined amount of time until another outbreak occurs where the lytic cycle is again initiated. And we think there are some environmental triggers, at least for herpes, which includes a weakened immune system, maybe co-infection with another virus, or stress can trigger another outbreak. And so we will go from latency back into the lytic cycle and then back into the latent cycle. And it can go round and round there. So let's look at that process again in detail here. So a term we use to describe the latent virus integrated into the host cell chromosome, the term we use is provirus. So real quick, going back to this picture here, notice here in this diagram, of course, this is bacteriophage, but they're showing us bacteriophage's DNA in blue squirted here into the cytoplasm of the cell. And then here's the integration stage, okay, where that blue viral DNA is integrated into the host DNA here. So when we talked about this in terms of the lysogenic pathway, we called it the prophage. But when we're talking about it in terms of human viruses, we call this the provirus. Okay, so the provirus would be the viral, I'm going to outline it in red so it shows up a little better. This would be the proviral DNA from the virus that infected that cell is now incorporated with a chromosome of the host cell and replicates along with the host cell. Once again, this means that the viral mRNA and the viral proteins are not made during the latency period. Remember, it's a dormant stage for this virus. The provirus will replicate along with the host cell as the host cell divides. Now, this is important. Remember we said only certain viruses undergo viral latency? Well, this is only possible for viruses with double-stranded DNA as their genetic core or viruses that can produce double-stranded DNA. Why is that so important to viral latency? Well, remember, our chromosomes are double-stranded DNA. So in order for the virus to integrate with our DNA, it needs to be the same structure. And remember, there are RNA viruses where their genome is single-stranded RNA or even double-stranded RNA, and those arrangements of genetic information are not compatible with the double-stranded DNA that is found in our chromosomes. So this process of latency is limited to double-stranded DNA viruses or viruses that can produce double-stranded DNA, like who? We learned about them in the last video on RNA viruses. So there is an example of an RNA virus that converts its RNA into double-stranded DNA. Do you remember what we call those viruses? That's right, we call them retroviruses. For example, HIV is a good example of a retrovirus. And those are RNA viruses that convert their RNA, their single-stranded RNA, into double-stranded DNA. And they use a very special enzyme to do that, remember? All right, the provirus can be reactivated. So remember, we can go back into an outbreak. Someone can have another herpes outbreak at some amount of time in the future. They'll have another outbreak. And this will just keep repeating throughout their life. So the provirus will be reactivated to undergo lytic cycle at any time. And there's some sort of environmental or immune system trigger that causes this that is not entirely well understood, but it seems to be related to a stress response as well as a weak immune system response. So here is, again, the information about the Herpes Simplex virus. There are two types, Simplex 1 and Simplex 2. These are viruses that sort of have their target cells either in the oral mucosa or in the genital mucosa. So causing the very characteristic blisters that are associated with the lytic cycle, the outbreak cycle. And then they go into a latency in the nerve cells. Okay, so it's in the nerve cells that they go in there. And then some sort of stress response. Now in lab cultures, sometimes it's UV light exposure, stress, or even hormones that can trigger the reactivation of the lytic cycle. All right. Let's talk about another famous latent virus, the Varicella Zoster virus. So the Varicella Zoster virus is the cause of chickenpox. You may know that chickenpox and shingles are both caused by Varicella Zoster. Now I have some questions I would like to ask you and see what you think. The first question is this: people who contract chickenpox as a childhood illness are at risk for developing shingles. Why? Because Varicella Zoster is another example of a latent virus, what that means is that if you contract this virus, which many children do in childhood, and that virus undergoes a lytic cycle initially, which is where you get the very characteristic blisters of chickenpox, and then you recover. Maybe you stay home from school for a week or two, but you recover. And in children, chickenpox is relatively mild, and it goes away. So the lytic cycle ends. But what happens is that the varicella zoster virus is a latent virus. So it goes into a dormant stage. It goes into a latent stage in the nerve cells, similar to herpes virus. It actually is in the same family of with herpes simplex. And so what happens is that later in life, now it is possible to develop shingles as a young adult, but it's more common to see shingles in middle age and in the elderly. And this may be in response to a declining immune system as we age. But what is possible is that generally in about 10 to 20% of people who contract chickenpox as a childhood illness, sometime later in their life will also contract shingles. And it's caused by the same virus. So the chickenpox virus has gone into hibernation and later will show its ugly face again and will re-enter or reactivate into the lytic cycle and cause the characteristic rash associated with shingles. And that is because this is how this virus works. It is a latent virus that, just like herpes, can reactivate later in life. Now consider this question. People who get the chickenpox vaccine, which came out in the 1990s, and what that means is you're vaccinated with a live attenuated version of the varicella zoster virus. And now it's part of routine childhood vaccines. Okay, so I interrupted myself. People who get the chickenpox vaccine, in other words, we'll assume they do not get the illness because they're protected as a result of the vaccine. They are protected against both chickenpox and shingles. Why is that? So I bring this up because in the future, if you become a registered nurse, one of your major duties will be to educate patients about vaccination. And maybe you will work in a pediatric facility where that will really be your everyday experience. Administering vaccines to children, talking to parents about vaccines, reassuring patients that vaccinations are safe and well tested and logical, and technology that has been around for 200 years and is probably the safest medication you can get. And you'll have patients that'll say to you, oh, I would just rather my kid gets chickenpox naturally. You see, when I grew up, there was no vaccine. And what parents oftentimes did, they would send their kids to the house of a kid that was infected with chickenpox to play with that kid with the hopes that your kid would get chickenpox, actually. We called it chickenpox parties. And there's an episode on South Park that makes fun of this. And you only get this if you grew up in the 90s or before, like I did, before the vaccine. But it was a real thing. It was called a chickenpox party. And it seems illogical now, but you would actually purposely put an infected child with chickenpox together with a healthy child in the hopes that the transmission would occur and that your healthy child would come down with chickenpox, because the reason is that chickenpox is very mild in children, but it is not so in adults. So it's not a good deal to get chickenpox as a teenager or even as a young adult or as an older adult. The reason is the immune response is very powerful to the Varicella Zoster virus during the lytic cycle. And it can cause a very severe inflammatory response that can even be deadly and require hospitalization in adults. And that is true. And so you now understand the logic behind those chickenpox parties prior to 1995 about. And so you may still have parents like that who will say, "Oh, I'll just send my child to a chickenpox party so that they get chickenpox as a kid and get it over with, get it out of the way, and then they'll be immune and they'll be fine for life." I don't want to vaccinate. Vaccines are bad. Vaccines cause autism. Ugh. Don't get me started about that one, guys. You've already heard my rant. No, they do not cause autism. Ah. So try not to bang the mother's head against the wall and say, "Look, come on." See, that's why you guys are going to be working with patients and not me, because I get frustrated, maybe overly frustrated with people that are ignorant about the realities of science. Anyways, so what should you tell this mother? Well, it's the amazing thing that if you get the chickenpox vaccine, you are protected against both chickenpox and shingles. And the reason is that the vaccine does not provide an opportunity for that virus to become latent. Got it? So there's no latent stage in the vaccine. Because it's not the live virulent virus, it is a live attenuated, but it's not the virulent virus, meaning it does not invade the cells permanently and will not reactivate in the future like the natural virus. So I know we all like natural. Natural sounds good, doesn't it? We want everything to be natural. And people will tell you, "I just want my child to naturally get chickenpox." And that's their choice. They can. But I think education is a very powerful thing. And so you should let them know, of course it's your choice whether you want to vaccinate your children or not. But I think it's interesting to look at the science. And what does the science tell us? The science tells us that if you come down with natural chickenpox, there's a 10 to 20% chance you will get shingles as an adult. And if you get vaccinated, you will not. Now, I have a little added extra tidbit to that, though, which is that current research suggests that if you want to fully be protected against varicella zoster, you should also get the Shingrix vaccine when you're 50 years old or older. And that is recommended to have complete protection against varicella zoster, because you may get the chickenpox vaccine as part of your childhood vaccines. Children born nowadays do, meaning that it's very rare to see chickenpox in nature or in natural, infections. It does happen. Again, there's a large population of people who don't vaccinate, but as you age, to have complete immunity, you want to get a booster, and that's what the Shingrix vaccine will do. It'll give you a booster of immunity to make sure you do not contract this virus, okay, as an adult, because that is very dangerous to contract the varicella zoster as an adult. Here's my slide on chickenpox. It is in the herpes virus family. The transmission is by respiratory droplets, so the chickenpox parties were to put the kids together and have them sort of cough on each other. And here's that statistic again about shingles, 10 to 20%. And the rash that you're seeing on the slide is somebody with shingles. And it doesn't always appear on the torso, although it can. You can also see shingles radiate out from the cranial nerve, so it can go across the face. Although the most common place to see it is around the waist, sort of like a belt. Actually, the word zoster means belt. So having a rash that goes around the waist or around the torso, it can be on the arms or the legs or the face, but it's caused by the dormant stage of this virus in the nerve ganglia. The last topic I'd like to cover with you with latency is another feature of some latent viruses. Some latent viruses can cause cancer. How would that work? Let's talk about it. So first of all, realize that some viruses are classified as carcinogens. A carcinogen is an agent that is known to increase your risk of developing cancer. But remember, when we use that word carcinogen, it's not a guarantee that you'll get cancer. For example, we know tobacco smoke is a carcinogen. We know that smoking cigarettes increases your risk for lung cancer, but it's not a guarantee. We can just tell you it increases your likelihood to a certain percentage, but it's not a guarantee. So same thing with the viruses. They are classified as very risky for developing cancer. So what is cancer? In biology, we define cancer as a growth disorder of cells in the body. It's your own cells, okay, that become cancerous. It's recognized currently that that is triggered by DNA damage to those cells and particular damage to genes that regulate cell division. So your cells divide by a process called mitosis. You may have learned about it in a general biology course. And then there's something called the cell cycle that regulates how long a cell can divide and repairs damage to the cell if it does accumulate damage. And so there are certain genes, we call them oncogenes, that help regulate cell division and can even kill off or cause abnormal cells to self-destruct in a process we call apoptosis. What happens is if those oncogenes are damaged, and there's lots of things that can cause that type of damage, like radiation, chemical exposures, and even some of the DNA damage is inherited in the DNA you inherit from your parents sometimes. But what happens is, for all these reasons, the oncogenes become disrupted, and this causes the cells to grow abnormally. And they grow and they form large masses of these identical cancer cells called tumors. And that's, you may know somebody who's had cancer. It is a very common illness, and many of us have known, people who have come down with cancer and watched them experience this horrifying illness. And it has all these stages. You may know there are all these stages to cancer. So the initial stage is just the initial tumor. Eventually, if it's untreated or undetected, which many cancers are, it will continuously divide. It's just these cells dividing out of control with no stopping them. And they will spread. And so that process is called metastasis. Or you'd use it as a verb. You would say the tumors have metastasized, meaning that they've broken off from the original tumor and now they're maybe in the blood, and then now they're on a highway system to other parts of the body, other organs. And they spread, more tumors form, and this progresses the cancer into later stages until eventually there's too much of it in the body, and it's crowding out and starving the healthy cells of the body, and then the body starts to shut down. And in the worst case scenario, someone would die. So it is possible for viruses to be a carcinogen in the same way that we say tobacco smoke and that UV radiation and certain other chemicals are carcinogens. And the reason is when we have a latent virus and when it integrates itself into the chromosome, if that integration occurs in an oncogene, it can result in DNA damage that can trigger this abnormal cell growth. There are 3 known cancer-causing viruses that I would like you to be aware of. The first is human papillomavirus, known as HPV. There are many different types of HPV, but some of the more virulent strains have been linked to cervical cancer in women and penile cancer in men. There is a vaccine that prevents infection from HPV, and it's called Gardasil, and it's a recommended vaccine for young adults to receive. Epstein-Barr virus. This is the cause of mononucleosis, which many people contract in childhood or young adulthood. It's oftentimes referred to as the kissing disease, transmitted by saliva, direct contact. But this is a virus that will become latent and can trigger Hodgkin's lymphoma later in life. There's no vaccine. Hepatitis B virus is also linked to liver cancer, and there is a hepatitis B vaccine. It is part of the childhood vaccine schedule. So I hope that is informative for you about latent viruses. Remember, not all viruses are latent, so only know the ones that we have discussed. Okay, I'll talk to you next time.